Well, sort of going back to what you were talking about with Gann, I know that he wrote about a lot of these cycles as well in The Tunnel Through the Air. So you can find a lot of the cycles that you've spoken about embedded in there. So these are things that have been known about for a long time. And obviously, you can go back even further than that and find indications to it in writings. We have George Tritch and Samuel Benner, who wrote their own financial timetables and observed patterns in prices and patterns in the area of the economy that they were analyzing. So a lot of what you've spoken about, it should be more common knowledge than it is. And it is, like you said, we're a bit like weather forecasters. We can't sort of tell you tomorrow necessarily what's going to happen, but we can tell you when the tornado is going to come through and it's going to ruin everything and the economy is going to go through that reset. And that was what enabled you to also, because I did it in my own publication as well, was talk about this crash point that was going to come in 2020. We knew it was going to be a recession. We didn't know what the exact trigger was going to be for that recession, but we were able to warn people in advance and warn people to get out of markets. You went one step further than that, Andrew, because you actually picked the exact peak of the market in February 2020. And I'd like you to talk a little bit about that because, I think a lot of people, once they get a grasp of how these cycle counts work, it becomes very exciting because you can give the probabilities for when the economy is going to collapse. So you can say, just like you have now, I mean, we could, 2029, everyone's looking at that date. Like you said, the 2020s was a very resonant cycle to what's happened in this cycle because of what we saw with the Spanish flu, and we had the COVID pandemic, the technological revolution that happened through the 2020s, the inflation that happened through that period of time. There was also tariffs that were introduced through that period of time as well, which impacted the American economy and deepened the 2030s downturn. So there are many resonances with that. And you said, the crash might come a little bit before, a little bit after. I don't think there's many people that can say, I got the exact peak of that market. You can do that. So how on earth do you go about forecasting that exact peak? I know you talk about collision of cycles.
So what we do, so we actually, I mean, that 2020's history, we've picked pretty much all the major peaks over the last 15, 18 years. And I mean, recently that we called a masterclass specifically because we knew a major high was coming in. I'll come back to the 2021, but the recent top, we did have a price target on the S&P 500 index of 6120, and I think it intraday traded at 6147 within 1/3%, and we got a triple top. But we had a whole series of super macro cycles lining up into this window from December through to January and February. So ultimately, we trade price and we trade pattern. As traders, you can't really trade time unless you're an options trader. So these big cycles were coming in, and then within that, we have a histogram system. We keep that proprietary. We keep it proprietary because I've never seen anybody else. I've never seen anything in the public domain about how short-term cycles are calculated. So we believe that's the key, and that's what gave us the exact high there. And as I say, we had over 70 people attend that masterclass. We deliberately had it in January on saying, look, get ready. This is it. People were talking about, well, Trump's in. It's going to be the Trump bump. We're off to the moon. We might head up higher, especially after the last 2 days. And in fact, the decennial cycle, what does the decennial cycle tell you? Years ending in 5 are bullish. And there's no reason to suspect that this year will not close higher than it started. So, yes, we got the high for 2025. And in a similar vein, what we did have going, let me just, it's exactly 5 years from that high to the previous high, the one that you just mentioned in, I think it's February 16th, February 17th, 2020. Well, that was a function of the 90-year cycle that was displaced by 6 weeks into the year. So if you take 6 weeks out of, out of 90 years, that's a pretty acceptable tolerance. And that's exactly what we saw. The pullback wasn't that great. It was only a 3-4 week pullback, but it's still sharp enough, and it did represent that cycle. So it's a case of seeing these super cycles come together And quite often you'll see a cycle that is 100 years. It might be 144 years, might be 180 years. And in fact, it's that's how we put it together. And the shorter term stuff, I do keep that proprietary, but we can also use Fibonacci proportion in time as well. So if you take 2 points and then project ahead in time, it's a fairly commonly known technique amongst the technical folks, amongst ourselves, but that helps as well. So we look for multiple confirmations. There is no holy grail per se, but if you suddenly say, there's like, I always say people don't always understand cycles, but say, you're in Melbourne, I'm over here in Surrey, and let's say somebody else is somewhere else, but say you go into your local cafe and have a cappuccino once every week, and the other person joins you maybe once a month, and I only come down from England once a year. What's the date that we're all going to be having that little party, that tea party in your cafe? So that's the day of the big event when everything comes together. So it's this idea of stacking things, also looking at proportion, and then of course there's lots of more sort of number based things of squaring time and price and so on. And I think they definitely have some degree of, we're getting a little bit esoteric here, but they have some input there as well. So we can see these, and it's with these same things that we're already seeing turning points manifest or coming together in 2028 and also in 2030. So, that 100-year cycle will be very similar. But equally, if I may, one of the things back in the 90s that we were looking at was a top of the dot-com boom. Everybody was jumping on board. It was a new millennium. Everything was very exciting, for those of you who remember. And the idea was the stock market was, well, now we've got PCs, personal computers, but now we've got portable phones and things like that. So this was like a great thing. So the stock market was going to go to the moon. Well, what we were aware of was that if you take 1929 as a pivot point and go back 72 years, it takes you to 1857, which I call it was one of the first modern day significant financial meltdowns, and it was what I call dual centric. Part of it was in America, where the railroad boom was coming to bust for about the third time, and it carried on again. But Europe also had this big financial crisis, again, partly to do with railroads, but more to do with some geopolitical factors. So if you take 1857, add 72 years, it takes you to 1929. Add 72 years to 1929 takes you to 2001. And, we saw a major top come in 2000, 2001. At that time, I was consulting to a very well-known operation, very well-known billionaire. I have a non-disclosure. I can't tell you who it was, but you would all know who he is. And they cashed in and got out of the market. So this is how it works. If this is their level of situational awareness, and so what does that tell us? Well, for those of you who are absolute youngsters, if you take 2001 and add 72 years, then you're going to see something pretty important in 2073. Okay, write it in your wills, tell your kids, tell your grandkids. Joking apart, this is how it works. So, you can halve that as well. So if you take 2037, adding 36 years, which is half of 72, 2037 is going to see a major financial event. So people say, well, is it going to be a high or a low? Well, the way you know is you look to see which way the market's going as you go into that time period, because these cycles will invert. There's no doubt about it. That's the trick. But it's where you get lots of these things coming together that you get the big events, and of course, everybody will say, it was a black swan. Nobody could have seen that coming. And of course, the Western governments really only have 4 year, 10 years. Dare I say, I'm going to make a very cynical comment. Those running a lot of the multinational corporations are in there to get their share options. They're not there for the long-term good of the company. There are some exceptions, but they'll walk away with their tens of millions, having been there for 5 years, 8 years. So there's no real. The same with politicians. It's what can you do to make an impact to stay in power, because we have this democracy, which isn't a natural law, by the way. That's not. They don't sit around in the jungle saying, okay, okapi, lion, giraffe, we'll all have an election And okay, giraffe, you're in for 3 years now, but I'm the lion and I can eat you anytime I want to. They don't do that. That's just not natural
Mm.
law. So,
Mm.
so there's a bit of a digression there, but the point is that people don't have a long enough horizon. You know, if you're going to be a politician for 4 years, you're worrying about winning the next election. And actually, one of the things that I think Trump's been quite smart about was he did have 4 years to prepare. His first presidency was quite different, and he came in with a very clear action plan this time. So, let's see what happens.
Yeah, there's a lot there what you said, but one of the things well, the decennial cycle is something that I write about quite a lot, and I know you mentioned esoteric, and I know you don't go into that so much in your public sphere. I write quite a bit about it in my own publication because it's a subject that's of interest to me, and I think anybody that has studied GAN or looked into that side of things understands that when you do that study, you really have to look at these things as well,
Yeah.
because that's what we're all looking at. And interestingly enough, when Samuel Benner wrote his book on the future, I can't remember the exact title of it now, but the predicting where prices were going to go, he talked very openly about this in his book, that it was to do with astrological patterns. He didn't understand scientifically why. Obviously, Ray Tomes talks about this, who's the science director for the Foundation of the Study of Cycles, and I interviewed him, and I'll link to that in the report that I send out with this. So that's one thing that my readers will be very aware, that years ending in 5 have been known to be the years where people make most of the money on the stock market, whereas a year ending in 7, you'll often see most of the losses because you get a sharp pullback in years ending in 7. And these patterns are extremely interesting. In fact, I was thinking when I was researching it, I don't know that there has been a financial crash in a year ending in 5, although there was one in 1825, which would be a 200-year cycle, which I think that was when 70 banks in England failed. I think it was England's first.
Exactly.
Yes. Yeah. So I was interested to ask you about.
1925 wasn't good for Britain either. So actually, you can see if we have any Brits watching this, you can see why we're having a pretty tough time with the policies of the present Labour government, because 1925 was a bad year and 1825 was terrible for Britain. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
And
it's so interesting, isn't it? And that actually, at that financial crisis in 1825, I think it spread through to Europe and Latin America as well. So I was wondering, when we got to 2025, I was thinking, well, this is the only thing, that I can kind of relate this year back to. We've got a bit of a 200-year cycle happening there. But even so, we've got this sort of overlay. And then the other thing that I thought is interesting, and I'm wondering whether you take this into your own analysis. Now, obviously, I work in the real estate industry. Georgism and looking at land and how land impacts the economy is something that forms the basis of my cycle analysis, which means that when the land markets collapse, you're going to have more of an extreme financial crisis than when just the stock market has a wobble on its own. So if we take, for example, the 2001 dot-com bubble and bust, it impacted certain sectors of the economy, and America went into recession. But because the land market didn't collapse at that time, and because the banks didn't go under at that time, it kind of shored up the economy and protected your mums and dads, for want of a better word, who have most of their money in their house price more so than most of their money in the stock market. But of course, when you get that land cycle collapse, that recession is going to be quite deep. And so that comes back to our 18.6-year pattern, or our 18-year pattern, which I go on more generally, because the land cycle really, when Roy Wenslick did his research into it, he called it 18 and a third years. 18.6 years was kind of overlaid onto it, I think probably because of the research by Gann and the financial timetable that was ascribed to him. And a lot of the cycles that you talk about can be broken down into 18 years. So you've got the 72-year cycle, the 90-year cycle, the 144-year cycle. The land cycle did shift after World War I. So when you were doing those 18-year counts and you were saying, oh, that gets us to 2001, that was actually a mid-cycle. It should have been the end of cycle, but because we had the break for World War I, when the land cycle recommenced, it shifted. So really the 18-year cycle, there's two major recessions that happen in that period of time. You've got the mid-cycle recession, and then you've got the end of cycle recession, which we term it, which is when the land market collapses, and that would naturally pull the economy into a greater depression. So whereas when I'm forecasting now and I'm saying, look, I'm writing a paper at the moment, which is for an economics organization. I mentioned it to you when we spoke on the phone last night, which we're hoping to put a big forecast out there publicly and say, this is the forecast, and put a bit of academic rigor behind it. But it's called, the Great Depression of 2028, because that's where I'm forecasting this depression will come. And of course, I'm forecasting it to be greater than it would be if it was just a stock market phenomena. So all of this is leading me to ask you, do you take that into account when you're forecasting these cycles? Do you think, okay, well, I've got a 72-year cycle. Is the land market going to collapse at this point, or is it going to be more of a stock market phenomena?
Yeah, so what we see, for example, is that the genus of different events of events is often, well, let me rephrase this. It's a circuitous answer to your question, but the idea is that when we got the global financial crisis of 2007, 2008, which obviously tied in with the land cycle, that was there based on a drying up of credit. Okay, that 2007, 2008. I mean, they'd argue it was the CDOs, CDSs, etc. in America, bad loans. But if you go back in that cycle, this is one that we forecast very clearly, and does briefing people about potential runs on banks. People were laughing, saying you won't get that in this modern era. And sure enough, we had that at Northern Rock here. People were queuing up outside 2007. But you go back 100 years to 1907, the rich man's panic, the Knickerbocker crisis. That was again the drying up of credit. So we got this credit related crisis there. And there was a crash in 1807, which was caused by the American Embargo Act to do with the Napoleonic Wars. But this 1807, 1907, 2007, generally it was about credit. So the 1807 one was more about blocking distribution of goods to Europe to try and remain and end the Napoleonic Wars. But there was a degree of cessation of American lending to Europe. So what we're seeing here is that in this case, it's a credit-based thing. All right. So we're seeing a drying up of credit at the same time as you're getting the property cycle coming into its peak point, as it were. And I think that's exactly what we saw also. There was in Britain, certainly in the late 80s, there was a major peak in housing, again, following this very same cycle you're talking about. And that was because it suddenly lending was reined in a bit and tax relief was taken away from it. So it's about the availability of money. So if you get a cycle that relates to an availability of money clashing with the 18.6-year cycle, which is really a generational cycle, but 18.3, 18.6, whatever you want to call it. But that's when you're going to get the more significant events, definitely. Equally, what we do see is there will be other cycles. Typically, stock market rally is about a new technology coming in. So AI, NVIDIA, all this sort of stuff. Then we had what do we have? These things, phones. Then we had before that we had PCs, and 1920s all about was radio, right? RCA, Radio Corporation of America. So to all these things, you get that drying up, and as that typically those booms last about 5 years, typically, but there are variations on them. Aviation obviously lasted a long time, and so you can see in the transportation cycles are 100 years, because if we go back to aviation, what we did see was the 90. Well, most of all the big airlines really started in about 1918, 1919, 1920, 100-year cycle on that took us to the peak at the pandemic, which killed airlines effectively. But you can also argue, the midpoint of that saw the beginning of the jet age, the jumbo jet and Concorde. So it's just perfect almost, but they're broad brushes, and the ability to be able to hone that information down into shorter patterns. So coming back to what you're saying is, yes, it's the synchronization of different cycles, and you need to see the overlay, and the overlays aren't always obvious. And in fact, that's where the black swan occurs. We knew this was going to happen. The stock market was looking toppy, but we didn't see the cycle in, say, that sector or this technology or a war cycle coming in as well. And that's where you'll suddenly have a different cause for an event, regardless the event takes place. It's just what caused it. Does that make sense, or have I gone off too
Yeah,
much of a
no,
tangent?
no, it does make sense. And I actually think it's interesting because, because my focus is on the land cycle and often, I sort of over focus on what land is doing. It was interesting looking at your research and seeing how you made those links in what would happen to aviation and how you made the pandemic. I know that Gann spoke specifically about pandemic being a 100-year cycle in the tunnel through the air. So it should have been
I don't know I didn't actually notice. I didn't realize he put that in there. I didn't because
yeah.
we found that something else. Okay, right,
Yeah,
fair enough.
I'll find the paragraph and
Again,
I'll put it in the report that I put out with this because I remember at the time I was writing for Fat Tail Investment Research, they were a little bit sensitive over what I would write sometimes, particularly if I went into esoteric things because they were worried about the subscriber base. So I remember when the pandemic came in, and I didn't forecast the pandemic in advance, but when it came in, I remember looking at Gann's stuff and noticing there was a paragraph in there about pandemics happening every 100 years. So I'll find that and put that in so that that was kind of why I was thinking, oh, these, it's so interesting. It's interesting, isn't it, that when Gann wrote at that time, I think it was illegal at that time to forecast astrology. I think that
yeah,
astrology had been wasn't the I'm trying to think of the famous astrologer at that time, and I can't remember her name. Um,
Evangeline Adams.
Yes, that's who I was trying to think of. Yeah, that's right.
So Pancholi Adams was astrologer. So let's put this into context for those of you who are unsure about these esoteric things. There's different types of astrology, and the planetary cycles are mathematical algorithms, basically. So these are very important cycles, and where this, obviously, in my study, I've looked at everything in depth, and there are areas where you can dismiss this stuff, and of course, regular scientists will be quite quick to dismiss this. But yeah, let's bring in Evangeline Adams. She was astrologer to J.P. Morgan, and she went pretty much everywhere with him. A lot of the deals were aligned with what she would suggest, and of course, astrology was deemed to be illegal. I think it's still illegal in some of the states. I think in Tennessee, I think, or Alabama. I don't know. But the point was that the whole matter was brought to court, and the it was proposed by the lawyers that um, uh, Miss Adams look at the birth chart of the judge and then report back, and at the end of which the judge said, "Well, I cannot disagree with some of the life events there," and so on, and therefore it sort of left it as an open situation. But yes, Evangeline Adams has definitely played an important part in this, and I think if you look at the information that's in there um, uh, in this sort of work, and you look at if we take let's take religion, okay, so let's take Christianity. The esoteric side of Christianity is Gnosticism. The esoteric side of Judaism is Kabbalah. The esoteric side of Hinduism is Tantra, and the esoteric side of Islam is Sufism. And whenever you look at any of these things, they all bring in mathematical cycles, and these cycles tend to align with planetary orbital periods. There's no doubt about that. We can't dismiss that. And in fact, the 18.6-year cycle that we've been talking about, is the lunar node cycle. There is a book by Louise McWhirter that is exclusively based on how the business cycle works around that as well. So, there is definitely something you've got to look at there. And of course, in Gann's day, which is how this came up just now, it was illegal to look at this sort of stuff. But the Bible it's not even failed. The Bible explicitly mentions all these mathematical cycles, and so they're all in there, as they are in all these other works. Let's say the Kabbalistic work, the Vedas, whatever you want to look at, these cycles are there, and they're passed down. I think that's how they're passed down to those who have the ability to study and interpret them.